And that's what the new book is about, because I'm talking about inspiration, like the idea of ideas that come from nowhere. The title of the book is From Nowhere. Thoughts that just pop into our head. For artists, they pay attention to those things. That's where they get their ideas.
So the muse.
The muse, or different cultures have had different words for it. Yeah, the Greeks had a lot of words for it. The muses, the demon is one word, but. And every culture has ideas about where ideas come from. It may be from the Lord, it may be from the gods, it may be from the muses or spirits, the spirit world, or whatever. I mean, every culture has theories about this. I know you've had Diana Pasulka on your show, and she writes about tech people who think that they get ideas from the non-human intelligences behind the phenomenon. That's a new kind of variant of a very old idea that that our thoughts come from some external source in the spirit world or whatever.
Yeah, there are people talk about a protocol you can follow where you can open up a portal to channel some sort of download, right? Some sort of creative download or inspirational download that can help them in what they're trying to ultimately achieve. Stephen Pressfield writes about this too. He has a book called The War of Art. He talks about channeling the muse. He's a writer, and he talks about, he spent his whole life writing, and talks about how he was a failed writer most of his life until he came up with The War of Art. And the muse, essentially, he talks about like showing up to work every day, sitting down and putting pen to paper. And he goes, every day, I have to sit down, I have to start writing every day. I don't know when the muse is going to show up, but all I know is I have to be disciplined to sit down, start writing, and then maybe an hour later, maybe 2 hours later, the muse will arrive, but you have to sit down and do the work first. And he also talks about a thing called, he talks about, what's the word he uses for it? It's like distractions or something. Anyways, he talks about all the things in life that are meant to, that try to distract you from achieving that, right? Like whatever it is, like distractions or doing other things, and it's really hard to channel that thing. Anyways, like you said, people have been talking about this throughout history.
Right. Well, what I'm arguing in the new book is that I'm not going to say it's not spirits or the Lord or or non-human intelligences, but that most of the time it's your own self, it's your future self. That's you are tapping into things that are going to happen in your future, and that's where your best ideas are coming from. They're coming from your future, and exactly the same way that it works in dreams. But you asked about it happening in waking life. Well, that's the way it happens for most. I mean, some artists certainly get their ideas from dreams, but they're most are getting them in this sort of inspired states, or when the muse hits them, or however you want to describe it. Right. And there's so there's a million compelling examples of people channeling their future in their art. I mean, we already saw Michael Richards. Let me give you another example, a beautiful example of this that I just learned about this, a few weeks ago after I'd finished the book, so I couldn't include it in the book. But this was a guy named, I can give you his actual name, Kevin Archer, because he wrote a blog post about it. A really beautiful little blog post. Where I had known him, or we had been communicating a few years ago, because after Time Loops, he sent me some of his precognitive dreams. He'd had a few really interesting precognitive dreams. I used one of them as an example in my dream workbook. But he this story was not a dream. So this starts when he was 10. Okay, he was in school he's in England, and I'm not sure exactly what grade that equates to in the English school system, but he was, I guess it was the last year of primary school or whatever. His teacher assigned the class to imagine that they were some ancestor of theirs in any kind of historical period, and to just write a story about being that ancestor. Okay. So this guy's name is Archer, and he said he'd always wondered about where that name came from. Okay, so he writes this story. He's just thinking this up. He writes this story where he's a bowman, an archer on a medieval battlefield. Okay, and he sort of describes the armor he was wearing, and describes the scene of the battle and all that, and describes that this ancestor of his, he describes how he had prevailed as a bowman so successfully that the king said, from now on you must call yourself Archer. Okay. So, the teacher apparently talked to his parents and said this was such a good story. I felt like I was transported into medieval times, whatever. Okay, so fast forward 40 years. Okay, he's now about 50, and his young daughter is asking about her heritage. And so he, again, he's now in an age where you can look these things up on the internet rather than, which wasn't the case, 40 years ago. So he starts doing a little genealogy research, or not even doing the genealogy research. He just immediately finds online that one of his distant cousins had been doing the genealogy of his family and had a vast spreadsheet of the Archer family. Okay. Well, the very first entry of this spreadsheet he sends him is the story of this bowman in Henry V's army at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And this ancestor was named Simon de Boys. All right. And if you know anything about the Battle of Agincourt, it was won partly because of the English bowmen. They were vastly outnumbered by the French in this forest or near a forest, but their bowmen were superior, and that the archers sort of won the day. And it's a very famous battle, and Shakespeare's Henry V, the famous speech, we band of brothers, that comes from Shakespeare's story about the Battle of Agincourt and Henry V. Anyway, so the very first cell in this spreadsheet about this guy's genealogy explains how Simon de Boys, was so successful as an archer or as a bowman in the Battle of Agincourt that Henry V awarded him an annual stipend of 5 marks or whatever, which was pretty good salary, on the condition that he change his name to Archer.
Huh.
Okay. So it's exactly what he wrote about randomly at age 10. Now, he, like any person who's at all skeptical, and you should be skeptical of these stories, he immediately reached out to his parents and said, "Did you guys know any of this history about our name? Had you ever told me this? Am I just imagining that I didn't know this at the time?" And they were just it was as new to them as it was to him. He never knew this history. And there's an added detail to it. A lot of people are going to hear that story and think, "Oh, well, maybe he was the reincarnation of Simon de Boys or something like that." Okay.
Oh yeah, he was remembering a previous life.
A life, yeah, okay.
That's what Kripal talks about too.
Well, in his subsequent to this, he learned that story about the origin of the name Archer happening after the Battle of Agincourt is false. That actually the family name Archer originates a few decades before that battle, and it wasn't that story at all. So it's not, he wasn't remembering some past life, because that was actually kind of fictional, or it was a fiction that he wrote, or a bit of kind of legend or folklore that you read.
Interesting, man.
So he was precognizing in his inspired moment, or it wasn't inspired. I mean, he was just forced to write a story in school. And so kind of what emerges under his pen as he's writing is this amazing learning experience he would have 4 decades in his future about his ancestry. It's just a lovely example of what I think happens all the time when artists are working, whether it's, getting that kind of random out of the blue, oh my God, this new idea, comes landing in your head, or whether you're just doing what you described, which is just kind of the work of sitting down and forcing yourself to work. I'll give you another example that's, I think some people are going to raise their eyebrows at this, and I would love to hear people's reactions to this, but, so I was watching. So I'm obviously, when I read artist biographies now, or when I learn about an artist's process, I'm always kind of, looking for possible examples of this. And so I was, a couple years ago when it came out, I was one of those people just utterly blown away by Get Back, the Peter Jackson's series about the Beatles and their creation of their penultimate album. What was it? Let It Be. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you saw the series, but it begins with Paul McCartney kind of noodling on his bass, the first strains of like what the song that became Get Back, mm-hmm. And he's kind of noodling, and like over the first few days, and this is about a rehearsal. They're kind of rehearsing for what they think is going to be a live show, and it's just it's. On the surface, it's kind of boring, but the fact that these are the Beatles, and if you grew up with the Beatles and in awe of the Beatles, it's like amazing to watch this, and it's the best, it's the best document of artistic creation that's ever been put on film. It's a phenomenal show, and it's just this footage of them in the studio like jamming essentially. Yeah. And you're watching these songs come together, essentially as you're watching. So anyway, so on January 7th, 1969, which is when the show starts, Paul McCartney is like noodling this idea, and it's like about the only line he has is get back, to where you once belonged. So, and then over the next 2 days, it sort of evolves a little, and he gets this idea. Okay, they're JoJo, something about JoJo, and then JoJo. Somehow he lives in Arizona, and like Tucson, Arizona. JoJo, get back, JoJo. They're just kind of like they're all kind of just playing around with this idea and like whatever. And then on January 10th in the morning. There's a book, by the way, that goes with this film, and so you can read the transcript and everything. It's amazing. So on the morning of January 10th, 1969, they're noodling this idea. John Lennon tosses out there, but he knew it wouldn't last. Okay, so that's another new line in the song. Okay, whatever. Okay, so that day at lunch, George Harrison leaves the band. He walks out. He stands up. He's so exasperated with like all the disagreements between his band members. There's a lot of frictions. Paul's being very bossy, and he feels George is just feeling unappreciated. So he walks out and he says, "See you around the pubs." So that's the big cliffhanger ending of the first episode of Peter Jackson's series. And so what transpires is over the following week, the other three Beatles all the four Beatles had to convene at Ringo's house to convince George to get back. And JoJo sounds a lot like George. And Harrison sounds a lot like Arizona. So I think...
Harrison sounds like what?
Arizona. I mean, the only words he had at this point were JoJo and Arizona,
Wow.
So... is this precognition on the part of Paul? Is he kind of channeling this kind of important upheaval that's about to happen in his life, that George Harrison's going to walk out of the band and they're going to have to like do some real, do something big to convince George to get back to where he once belonged. But there's more irony here. That line, get back to where you once belonged, actually came from a song that George had written called Sour Milk Sea. And it was a song about getting out of situations that you don't want to be in because they're not satisfying. And he'd just written this song, and he'd given it to another artist to record. So basically, Paul McCartney had essentially stole this idea from George, who was already disgruntled. Oh my God. About get back to where you once belonged, and then creates this song. And of course, it never would have occurred to any of the Beatles that that's what this song was about. They kind of the song then evolved, and they even thought, well, maybe it was somehow about immigration and stuff. There's a lot of theories and whatever. And then there's another character they added and all that. None of this would have ever been conscious. But I just find it really uncanny that Paul McCartney has this idea, for, telling someone to get back. It's just like, it's all just telling someone named Jojo, get back, Jojo, get back, Jojo, get back to where you once belonged.
That's fascinating.
And then in, literally 3 days that he is in that situation of having to convince George to get back to where he once belonged.
Right.
So anyway, it's an example. This is not one of the main examples in my book because I think people are going to go, yeah, but if you're at all open to the suggestion I'm making that inspiration and creativity might often involve these kind of precognitive,
the muse.
upheavals in our future.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting.